London, November 1992. Michael Caine was taking one of his solitary walks through Highgate Cemetery, using these quiet moments among the weathered headstones and ancient trees to clear his mind and find the kind of peace that seemed increasingly difficult to achieve in his busy professional life. At 59, Michael had developed the habit of visiting London's historic cemeteries not out of morbid fascination, but because he found in these places a perspective on life and mortality that helped him maintain emotional equilibrium in an entertainment industry that often seemed disconnected from deeper human realities. The November afternoon was gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made the cemetery's Victorian monuments glisten with moisture and gave the entire landscape an atmosphere of melancholy beauty that Michael found both sobering and somehow comforting. But as he rounded a corner near the cemetery's military section, he encountered a sight that would stop him in his tracks and ultimately lead to one of the most meaningful friendships of his life. An elderly man kneeling beside a simple military gravestone, his shoulders shaking with grief so profound and heartbreaking that it was impossible to ignore. And what Michael discovered about this man's loss and his decades-long struggle to honor his son's memory would inspire him to take action that would touch hundreds of lives and demonstrate the extraordinary power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. The old man appeared to be in his 70s, wearing a worn but well-maintained overcoat and a military beret that suggested he had served in the armed forces himself. His hands were pressed against the gravestone, and Michael could hear him speaking in a voice broken by tears, though the words were too soft to make out from where Michael stood. The gravestone was simple and white, marked with military insignia that indicated the person buried there had died in service to his country. Michael's first instinct was to continue walking, respecting the man's privacy during what was clearly an intensely personal moment of grief. But something about the profound loneliness of the scene, this elderly man mourning alone in a cold cemetery on a gray November afternoon, compelled him to approach carefully and see if there was any way he could offer comfort or assistance. "Excuse me," Michael said gently as he drew near, not wanting to startle the mourning man. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I couldn't help noticing that you seem to be in distress. Is there anything I can do to help?" The old man looked up with red-rimmed eyes, clearly embarrassed to have been seen in such an emotional state. He wiped his face with a handkerchief and struggled to compose himself. "Oh no, thank you very much," he said in a voice that carried the crisp accent of someone who had served as a military officer. "I'm quite all right, just having my weekly chat with my boy here." Michael glanced at the gravestone and could now read the inscription: Lieutenant David Wilson, Royal Marines, born the 15th of April 1960, died the 14th of June 1982, Falkland Islands. Beloved son of George and Mary Wilson, he gave his life for Queen and country. The dates told a story that hit Michael like a physical blow. David Wilson had been only 22 years old when he died in the Falklands War 10 years earlier. He had been barely more than a boy when he gave his life in service to his country. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Michael said quietly, sitting down on a nearby bench that provided a view of David's grave. George Wilson, for that, was clearly who this mourning father was. Nodded slowly, still clutching his handkerchief. 22 years old, George said, his voice thick with emotion. Just a baby, really. Had his whole life ahead of him. He was going to be married when he came back from the Falklands. Sarah waited for him for 2 years after he died, hoping there had been some mistake, that he might come home. But of course he never did. "What happened to Sarah?" Michael asked gently. "She eventually married someone else and moved to Australia. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but it was too painful for both of us. Too many memories of what might have been." George looked at the gravestone with an expression of infinite sadness. "David was my only child. My wife Mary and I tried for years to have children, and when David finally came along, we thought he was a miracle. Mary died 5 years ago. Cancer, and now it's just me coming to visit our boy." Michael was moved by the profound loneliness in George's story. This man had lost his son to war and his wife to disease, and now spent his final years maintaining a solitary vigil at his child's grave. "Do you come here often?" Michael asked. "Every week," George replied. "Every Sunday afternoon, rain or shine, for the past 10 years. I tell David about what's happening in the world, about changes in the neighborhood, about the other military families I've met here. I read him letters that arrived from his old mates who served with him. Tell him about the memorial services and reunions. George's dedication to maintaining this connection with his deceased son was both heartbreaking and inspiring. What did David do in the Marines? Michael asked, sensing that George would welcome the opportunity to talk about his son's service. He was a communications specialist, George said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about David's military career. Brilliant with electronics and radio equipment, the officers said he was one of the most technically skilled young Marines they'd ever trained. He could fix anything, could establish communications in conditions where other specialists had failed. George reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, from which he extracted a photograph of the young man in military dress uniform. This was taken just before he shipped out to the Falklands, George said, handing Michael the photograph. Look at that smile. He was so proud to be serving his country, so excited about the challenge of proving himself in his first real military operation. Michael studied the photograph of David Wilson Tate, a handsome young man with his father's intelligent eyes and a confident smile that suggested he had no doubt about his ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. He looks like he was an exceptional young man, Michael said, returning the photograph to George. He was, George agreed. Not just as a soldier, but as a person. Kind, generous, always looking out for the younger Marines in his unit. The letters I've received from men who served with him all say the same thing. David was the kind of person who made everyone around him better. How did he die? Michael asked carefully, not wanting to cause George additional pain but sensing that he needed to tell David's story. Communications equipment malfunctioned during a critical operation, George said. David volunteered to go out under enemy fire to repair radio equipment that was essential for coordinating the unit's movements. He knew it was dangerous, but he also knew that without communications, his entire platoon could be lost. George's voice grew stronger as he continued the story, as if telling it gave him a way to honor David's courage. He successfully repaired the equipment and re-established communications, but an Argentine sniper got him as he was making his way back to cover. He died instantly, but his repair work allowed his unit to complete their mission successfully and probably saved dozens of British lives. Michael was struck by the heroic nature of David's sacrifice and the terrible irony that this young man's technical skills and willingness to risk his life for his comrades had ultimately cost him his future. David was recommended for a posthumous decoration for bravery, George continued. We received his military cross at a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. It was the proudest and most heartbreaking day of our lives. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, both men absorbing the weight of David's story and the magnitude of George's loss. George, Michael said finally, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what do you do with yourself when you're not visiting David? Do you have other family, friends, activities that give your life meaning? George's expression grew sad again. Not really, I'm afraid. Mary and I had a small circle of friends, but most of them drifted away after David died and Mary got sick. People don't quite know what to say to someone who's lost a child, and after a while they stop trying. What about other military families? Other parents who've lost children in service? I've met a few here in the cemetery and we've exchanged stories, but most of us are dealing with our own grief and don't have much energy left over for supporting others. Michael realized that George was essentially living in isolation, with no meaningful connections to sustain him beyond his weekly visits to David's grave. George, Michael said, I'd like to ask you something and I hope you'll consider it carefully. Would you be interested in having lunch with me next week? I'd like to learn more about David's story and about your experience as a military parent. George looked surprised by the invitation. That's very kind of you, Mr. Michael Caine, Michael replied, extending his hand. George's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the name. The actor? The Michael Caine? Just Michael, Michael said with a smile. And I'm serious about lunch. I think David's story deserves to be heard by more people, and I suspect you have wisdom about loss and resilience that could help other people who are dealing with similar challenges. George seemed uncertain about accepting the invitation from such a famous person. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure what someone in your position would want with an old widower who spends his time talking to gravestones. George, Michael said firmly, you're the father of a hero who made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. You've survived losses that would destroy many people, and you've maintained your dignity and love for your son through 10 years of grief. That's not just admirable, it's inspiring. The following week, Michael and George met for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Hampstead, beginning what would become a weekly tradition that continued for many years. During that first meal, Michael learned more about George's background and his life before and after David's death. George had served as a military engineer for 25 years, retiring as a colonel just a few years before David enlisted in the Marines. He had met Mary while stationed in Germany, and they had built a life together that revolved around military service, travel, and eventually the joy of raising their son David. "Mary and I always worried about the risks of military service," George told Michael during lunch. "But we also understood that service was a family tradition and a source of pride. My father served in World War II, I served during the Cold War, and David wanted to carry on that tradition." Michael was struck by the dignity with which George spoke about military service and sacrifice, and by his complete lack of bitterness about the price his family had paid. "Do you ever regret encouraging David to join the Marines?" Michael asked. George thought about the question for a long time before answering. "I regret that he died," George said finally. "I regret that Mary and I never got to see him married, never got to have grandchildren, never got to watch him build a career and a life. But I don't regret that he served his country with honor and courage. David died doing something he believed in, something that mattered." Over the course of their weekly lunches, Michael began to understand the depth of George's isolation and the challenge he faced in finding meaning and purpose in his life after losing both his son and his wife. "The hardest part isn't the grief," George explained during one of their conversations. "Grief is natural when you lose someone you love. The hardest part is the feeling that David's life and sacrifice don't matter to anyone except me. The war was over quickly, people moved on to other concerns, and it sometimes feels like David and the other young men who died have been forgotten." This conversation gave Michael an idea that would ultimately transform both George's life and the lives of many other military families. "George," Michael said, "what if there was a way to make sure that David and the other Falklands veterans aren't forgotten? What if we could create something that would honor their memory and support their families?" "What do you mean?" "I mean a foundation or organization that would provide ongoing support to military families who have lost loved ones in service. Something that would ensure that their sacrifice is remembered and that their families receive the support they need." George looked intrigued but uncertain. "That sounds wonderful, but I wouldn't know how to begin something like that." "I would," Michael said. "And I'd like you to help me. You understand the needs of military families in ways that I never could. Your experience with loss, your knowledge of military culture, your connection to other families who have faced similar challenges." Michael proposed establishing the David Wilson Memorial Foundation, which would provide financial assistance, counseling services, and community support to families of service members killed in action. The foundation would also create memorial programs that would ensure that the stories and sacrifices of fallen soldiers were preserved and shared with future generations. "We could start by reaching out to other Falklands families," Michael suggested. "Find out what kind of support would be most helpful. What needs aren't being met by existing programs." George was moved by Michael's proposal and by his willingness to use his fame and resources to honor David's memory. "You barely knew my son, but you're willing to create a foundation in his name," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do something like that?" "Because David's story matters," Michael replied. "Because your sacrifice as a military parent matters. Because there are other families out there who are struggling with grief and isolation just like you were, and they deserve support and recognition." The David Wilson Memorial Foundation was formally established in 1993. With Michael providing the initial funding and George serving as the Director of Family Services. The foundation's mission was to ensure that no military family would face their loss alone, and that the service and sacrifice of fallen soldiers would be remembered and honored by future generations. The foundation's first initiative was to create a network of support groups for military families who had lost loved ones in service. These groups met monthly in locations throughout the UK, providing opportunities for parents, spouses, and siblings to share their experiences and support each other through the challenges of grief and adjustment. George, drawing on his own experience of loss and his natural empathy for other grieving families, became the heart and soul of these support groups. His ability to listen without judgment, to offer practical advice based on his own journey through grief, and to help other families find meaning and purpose after loss made him an invaluable resource for hundreds of military families. George has an extraordinary gift for helping people feel less alone in their grief, observed Dr. Sarah Collins, a counselor who worked with the Foundation's support programs. He doesn't try to minimize their pain or rush them through the healing process. He just lets them know that someone understands what they're going through and that it's possible to survive and find purpose even after devastating loss. The Foundation also established scholarship programs for children of fallen service members, memorial gardens at military installations, and an annual ceremony that honored all British service members who had given their lives for their country. Michael's involvement in the Foundation brought national attention to the needs of military families and the importance of remembering and honoring military sacrifice. His participation in fundraising events, memorial services, and support group meetings helped raise both money and awareness for the Foundation's programs. Michael could have simply written a check and walked away, George reflected years later, but he chose to stay involved, to learn about military families and their needs, to show up at events and actually listen to people's stories. That level of commitment made all the difference in the Foundation's success. The Foundation's work also helped George find a new sense of purpose and meaning in his life. Instead of spending his time alone with his grief, he was now dedicating his days to helping other families and ensuring that David's memory lived on through service to others. Working with the Foundation has given me a way to channel my love for David into something positive, George said. Instead of just mourning his death, I'm celebrating his life by helping other families who are facing what Mary and I went through. The annual David Wilson Memorial Service became one of the most important events in the British military calendar, bringing together hundreds of military families, active service members and government officials to honor fallen soldiers and support their families. Michael spoke at these services every year, but he always made sure that George was the featured speaker, giving him the opportunity to tell David's story and to speak about the importance of supporting military families. David Wilson represents all the young men and women who have given their lives in service to this country, George would tell the assembled crowd. They died believing that their sacrifice mattered, that their service would be remembered, and that their families would be cared for. It's our responsibility to make sure that belief was justified. The Foundation's impact extended far beyond its formal programs. The network of military families that George had helped create became a source of ongoing support and friendship for hundreds of people who might otherwise have faced their grief in isolation. Many of these families remained connected for years, attending each other's milestone events, supporting each other through additional challenges, and creating a community based on shared experience and mutual understanding. The Foundation didn't just help us cope with our loss, said Margaret Thompson, whose son was killed in Afghanistan. It gave us a new family of people who truly understood what we were going through and who cared about keeping our children's memory alive. George's transformation from an isolated, grieving father to a respected advocate for military families inspired many other people who were dealing with loss to find ways to channel their grief into service to others. George showed us that it's possible to honor our loved ones by helping other people who are facing similar challenges, said Robert Davies, whose daughter was killed while serving in Iraq. His example taught us that we could choose to let our loss make us bitter and isolated, or we could choose to let it make us more compassionate and connected to others. By 2005, the David Wilson Memorial Foundation had grown into one of the UK's most respected military family support organisations, providing services to over 1,000 families annually and maintaining memorial programs that ensured the stories of fallen service members would be preserved for future generations. Michael continued his active involvement with the Foundation for over 20 years, but he always credited George with being the organization's true leader and inspiration. George taught me that real heroism isn't just about dramatic acts of courage on the battlefield, Michael said at the Foundation's 20th anniversary celebration. It's also about the courage to continue living with purpose and compassion after experiencing devastating loss. George exemplifies that kind of heroism every day. When George died peacefully in 2015 at the age of 92, his funeral was attended by hundreds of military families whose lives he had touched through his work with the Foundation. The service was held at Westminster Abbey, and Michael delivered the eulogy, speaking about George's extraordinary capacity for transforming personal tragedy into service to others. George Wilson spent the first part of his life serving his country as a military officer, Michael said at the funeral. He spent the second part of his life serving military families who had made the ultimate sacrifice. In both roles, he demonstrated the highest ideals of duty, honor, and service to others. The David Wilson Memorial Foundation continues to operate today, serving military families throughout the UK and expanding its programs to meet the evolving needs of service members and their families. The Foundation's headquarters features a memorial wall listing the names of all British service members killed in action since the Falklands War, ensuring that their sacrifice is remembered and their families know that their loss has not been forgotten. A statue of George Wilson stands in the Foundation's memorial garden, showing him kneeling beside David's grave in the pose that Michael first encountered him in that November afternoon in 1992. The inscription reads, "Colonel George Wilson, devoted father, military hero, servant of military families." Michael visits the statue regularly, often bringing flowers and spending time reflecting on the friendship that began with a chance encounter in a cemetery and grew into one of the most meaningful relationships of his life. When Michael Caine found the old man crying at his son's grave that gray November day, he could have simply walked past and left George to mourn alone. Instead, he chose to offer comfort to a stranger, to listen to a heartbreaking story, and ultimately to help transform that story of loss into a legacy of service and support for others. The David Wilson Memorial Foundation stands as a testament to the power of compassion to heal wounds, create meaning from tragedy, and demonstrate that even the deepest grief can be channeled into forces for good in the world. But the impact of that chance encounter in Highgate Cemetery extended far beyond the establishment of a single charitable organization, creating ripple effects that touched thousands of lives and demonstrated how individual acts of kindness could grow into movements that transformed entire communities. The Foundation's work revealed the extent of unmet needs among military families throughout the UK, many of whom had been struggling with loss, trauma, and isolation without adequate support from existing institutions or government programs. Before the David Wilson Memorial Foundation was established, military families who lost loved ones often felt forgotten by society, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, a social worker who studied the Foundation's impact. There were formal ceremonies and official recognition, but very little ongoing support for the daily challenges of grief, financial hardship, and social isolation that these families faced. The Foundation's approach to supporting military families was revolutionary because it recognized that grief was a long-term process requiring sustained attention rather than just immediate crisis intervention. George understood that losing a child in military service wasn't something you got over Midas, it was something you learned to live with, said Counselor Margaret Collins. He designed programs that supported families for years and recognized grief as natural, not something to overcome. The Foundation's peer support program paired newly bereaved families with others who had experienced similar losses years earlier, allowing families like George's to transform their grief into help for others. George's role in developing these programs gave him purpose he had never experienced even during his military career. His empathy, combined with his own experience of loss, made him uniquely qualified to help other families navigate the complex emotions following military deaths. The Foundation's scholarship programs also created lasting impacts that extended across generations. Children who received educational support through the Foundation often went on to successful careers and became advocates for military families in their own right. The scholarship I received from the David Wilson Memorial Foundation didn't just pay for my education, said Amanda Foster, whose father was killed in Northern Ireland. It showed me that my father's sacrifice mattered to people beyond our immediate family, and that inspired me to dedicate my own career to supporting military families. Amanda eventually became a social worker specializing in trauma counseling for military families, directly continuing the Foundation's mission through her professional work. The Foundation's memorial programs also had profound impacts on how British society understood and honored military service. The annual David Wilson Memorial Service became a focal point for national reflection on the costs of military service and the importance of supporting military families. The memorial services organized by the Foundation helped shift public conversation about military service from abstract discussions of policy and strategy to concrete recognition of the human costs borne by service members and their families, observed historian Dr. James Morrison. These events made military sacrifice personal and relatable in ways that traditional commemorations often failed to achieve. Michael's continued involvement with the foundation also influenced his approach to his entertainment career, leading him to become more selective about projects and more intentional about using his platform to support causes that aligned with his values. After getting to know George and learning about the challenges faced by military families, I started asking different questions about the roles I accepted. Michael reflected. I wanted to be involved in projects that honored service, sacrifice, and the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. This shift in priorities led to Michael's acclaimed performances in several war films and dramas that explored the human dimensions of military service, including roles that specifically dealt with themes of loss, grief, and the ways that communities support each other through difficult times. The Foundation's influence on military policy and support services was equally significant. Government officials regularly consulted with Foundation staff about the design and implementation of programs for military families, recognizing that George's experience and insights provided valuable perspectives that were often missing from policy discussions. The David Wilson Memorial Foundation became an unofficial think tank for military family support policy, said former Defense Minister Sir Charles Henderson. George Wilson's understanding of what military families actually needed, combined with Michael Caine's ability to bring attention to these issues, created a powerful advocacy voice that influenced legislation and funding decisions for decades. Several government programs for supporting military families were directly modeled on approaches pioneered by the Foundation, extending its impact far beyond the families it served directly. The international recognition that the Foundation received also inspired similar organizations in other countries, creating a global movement of support for military families that traced its origins to that chance encounter in Highgate Cemetery. The Foundation's work also contributed to broader social understanding of grief and trauma. The approaches developed for supporting military families were adapted for use with families dealing with other forms of traumatic loss. The physical memorials created by the Foundation also had lasting impacts on how communities honored service and sacrifice. The memorial gardens and monuments provided spaces for reflection that served entire communities. The Foundation's success also demonstrated the power of partnerships between celebrities and ordinary citizens with expertise and passion for particular causes. Michael's fame, combined with George's knowledge within the military community, created a collaboration more effective than either could have achieved alone. The Foundation's continued growth in the decades following George's death showed that the organizational structure and philosophy he developed were sustainable and transferable to new leadership. Today, the David Wilson Memorial Foundation serves over 2,000 military families annually and has expanded its programs to include veteran support, job training for military spouses, and educational programs that help communities understand military families. Michael continues to serve on the Foundation's board and remains actively involved, but the organization now operates primarily under leadership of military family members and veterans who bring their own experiences to the Foundation's work. The chance encounter between a famous actor and a grieving father in a London cemetery 30 years ago continues to generate positive impacts that touch new lives every year, demonstrating that individual acts of compassion can create legacies that extend far beyond their original circumstances.